Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a new edition of Quods Get Gold. Uh, Tonight, we have again my good friend and senior fellow at the Gold Institute for International Strategy, J. Lawrence Cunningham. I'm going to let him tell you more about this, but as the bio underneath uh, uh, describes in full, he is a Renaissance man with a vast experience in the Secret Service and other services that gives him a rather ample um, toolbox uh, to assess past, present, and future situations. Uh, Without further ado, let me bring him in and start this show because you're here to listen to him, not me. Good evening, Larry. How are you doing?
Good evening, Saul, and good evening, everyone. Good to be with you.
Okay. Well, you probably heard what I was saying, uh, inartfully though it may have been. We do have a full bio of you in the description of the video. And I think, that I would probably leave 90% out if I try to do it by memory. But some of the most salient aspects was your work in the Secret Service in security details for, was it two presidents or three?
Well, actually, I've supported many, but I was primarily assigned to Ronald Reagan, but I did a lot of work with Clinton, subsequently also Nixon and Bush Sr., and many other dignitaries, foreign dignitaries, and other heads of state.
Yes, I imagine that in doing so, you encounter a number of unforeseen situations.
Yes, and that seems to be the word of the day: unforeseen situations. And we find ourselves in one of those situations currently with our former president, 45, Donald Trump. And so I was asked to discuss a little bit of that today. And speaking of resilience and adaptability, we're going to talk about that as we progress with our show this evening.
Right. And let me clarify one point because, media, left, right, center, up, and down, have a tendency to screech for clickbait and all that jazz. And you would see headlines, President Trump might go to jail and all that jazz. I personally do not believe that the water will get to that shore, that President Trump is not anywhere near going to jail. So this is not what we're here for. What we're here for is, even in the unlikely circumstance, and this is why I believe these are uncharted waters. In the unlikely situation in which he may be ordered to jail, there is going to be quite a bit of a conflict between the Secret Service and the situations in which the president may be thrown into. And this is what I wanted to discuss. What would happen? How would it be handled? Is there any cause for alarm?
Well, those are excellent questions, and especially in the context of the fact that we've never really been in this situation in our great American history. What I'd first want to do is frame this into three areas. The first one is having faith in our country, in our principles, in our culture, in our people. It is being strained, needless to say, right now, to the point that it's almost unbelievable. It's almost apocalyptic. However, I think at the end of the day or the end of the year, our folks, the great citizens of this country, will be resilient and be able to weather this storm. The next part of this, before I begin, is I want to talk about resilience, not only of the folks in the United States, all the disasters and all the challenges we've had over the years, and they've been evolving, they've been historic, and they occur in millennia. But that piece is going to allow us to keep our faith going and also adapt to changing circumstances. The current circumstances are challenging not only the citizens, but also the Secret Service, as you've discussed. And the last part, of course, is galvanizing our hope in the process. So to answer the question, the burning question, how do we handle a situation with a protectee that is being, frankly, prosecuted fairly or unfairly? How do you reconcile the mission of protecting that person who represents the United States, represents the people, represents our culture, and frankly, the free world in terms of how we're perceived? It can be a challenge. In the Nixon days, it was pretty straightforward. He, at the end of his tenure, end of his presidency, he bowed out more or less gracefully with Watergate, and he still retained a detail. Over a period of time, he chose to sign off on that detail. So that was sort of the beginning of one of the challenges in how to reconcile someone that's under legal scrutiny and how to maintain protection. The next example, of course, is Clinton. I'm familiar with that one because that was getting closer to what we have today. And the challenge there, and I even spoke at a legal forum about this, was how do you reconcile your duty as an agent in the Secret Service on a protective detail to protect a person? How do you reconcile that with perhaps another law enforcement entity prosecuting that person? Where are the lines? And I was asked this, I studied it carefully, I talked to some legal experts, and the conclusion was, at that time, the agents are charged with a very specific title and statute, and that is Title 18, 3056. And I'll read it to you just very briefly to be exactly correct, but it defines protection of a specific high-level protectee, the president, the vice president, other dignitaries, other foreign heads of state, and so forth. And there's a gradation along that, but it's very specific. The next applicable statute is Title 18, 1752. And this is where some of the challenge might come. And I'll read that to you to make sure that we're all on the same sheet of music. And basically, Title 18, 1752 talks about restricted buildings or grounds. If the president, whether it be Biden, Clinton, Trump, whomever, are in an environment where they are restricted in terms of their legal charges, let's put it that way. Well, that statute still applies. That statute is still relevant. So all the rules and all the legal authority to protect that person under 3056 takes on an additional dimension when you take that person to a building, whether it be a hotel, whether it be the Capitol grounds, whether it be an area in a Super Bowl, an arena, a play, a theater, whatever the case may be. So there are very specific regulations, very specific statutes in the law that apply to that. Now, under this current situation, this is being tested more than it ever has in our history. It's being tested more in terms of the country's ability to absorb it, deal with it, and understand it. So we're all very stressed. We're all at the max of this conundrum, if you will. This is a very, very difficult area, unprecedented. But when you don't have any precedent, it's very difficult to navigate. We do have a precedent to some degree with Clinton. I was asked that question. And so, for example, with his challenges at the White House and other issues, he was under the Secret Service protection, but he had to go testify. He had to offer DNA tests, all those things. Well, even though that was a difficult situation, the mission of the agents assigned to the White House on the Presidential Protective Division were very clearly defined in that statute, whether he was at the White House or testifying or being interviewed in a deposition. So the next level that we've never seen is the situation where we have 4 indictments against a former president. He is still under the purview of 3056 as well as 1752. Now, the question becomes, how is that adapted? Let me give you a little bit of an insight here. The agents assigned to him don't all of a sudden change their authority or change their commitment to protect that person or persons. They are focused on that, and they have to do it in a number of environments. Whether he's having legal or she's having legal challenges, that's the purview of another authority. But you can't have the agents do both. So in the absence of a lot of examples, what the conclusion would be, it would be adapting. The agents would protect that person no matter where he or she is. And you would allow due process to continue, whether it's prosecution or defense. You would allow that to continue, but you would have to maintain the sanctity and the sacredness of that protective bond. Let me make one more comment about that, and then Saul, I'd like you to ask some questions. Here's the challenge. For example, if the protectee sensed that the agents that were protecting him or her were now in the middle of the road, if you will, or if they were on the fence and they were trying to decide, where does my authority begin and end? I'm protecting this person with authority, well-established title authority, but I'm also a law enforcement person. And am I supposed to wear 2 hats and facilitate an investigation or prosecution? The answer is no. That's unfair. You can't do both. So what you have to do is you have to stay committed to your mission, allow the other side of it, the prosecution, other law enforcement personnel to do their duty. But the thing is, you have to reconcile this. You have to make arrangements to not dilute that protection, at the same time allowing due process.
While allowing the other law enforcement agencies to do their duty.
Yes.
I believe, by the way, this is something that is not usually discussed. We can come back a little bit later, but January 6th gives us a good example of what you're
Yes, and I'll get to that in a moment. But I want to bring up something that's nuanced, it's subtle, but it's critically important. I mean, it's viscerally important. And that is, if you're protecting someone and they sense that you are chilling your focus, or you're maybe moving into the arena,
you lose their trust.
You lose their trust. And everything we do in that agency, which I was a member of for 20 years, and I protected many, many, many people, famous and not so famous, but it didn't matter. The bond was critically important. That rapport with the principal, critically important, because again, we're protecting that position, and that position represents a greater cause, a larger population. It represents the United States. So you're riveted to that mission, you're riveted to that focus, and you want to make sure that that protectee doesn't put him or herself in danger if they sense that you are diluting your focus.
Right. In order to effectively protect the president, it is indispensable that the president place himself in your hands. If he does so reluctantly or fearing that you may not step to the plate, the level of protection that you can offer, I imagine, is greatly diminished.
That's absolutely true. And even there are times when there are certain things happening in the political winds, all of us pride ourselves as being apolitical.
Yes.
You may have private leanings one way or the other, but when it comes to protection, it has to be apolitical, it has to be pure, it has to be focused. And this is the type of thing that is being challenged now with these candidly innumerable indictments that many of us think
Yes,
are
and
profound.
I would say it was a little bit more, because one thing that worries me, not to the point of losing sleep, but something that makes me think, is the extremes into which we are bringing politicization of law enforcement, and that eventually makes all of us lose trust in the system, and that is the only thing that keeps it going.
I couldn't agree more, Saul. And it's eroding our abilities, whether it's the public, law enforcement, or protective agents.
I'll pose an
Do their
idea to
job.
you that the other day, having a chat, uh, I was thinking of the enormous damage done during the 1930s to the reputation of Congress. Uh, Certain things were done, acts of Congress ceding legislative authority into the person of the president, kind of, the kind of thing one sees in South American dictatorships actually did happen here in the 30s, or the creation of executive agencies that usurp the powers of the legislative. And when you turn around, Congress began to drip in the esteem of Americans, to the point that today is one of the least respected institutions in the country. People believe partisan newspapers more than they do Congress. With the presidency, great damage was done during Watergate and the events leading to the Nixon resignation. People don't realize that the guy who won the presidency in an unprecedented landslide within a couple of years was being escorted out of the White House, and a lot of Americans lost faith in the presidency. And now the same thing is happening to the judicial, which had managed to escape this trend and remain a mostly respected institution throughout the country, even when most people don't trust Congress and many don't trust the presidency. People still trusted the judicial, and that is being eroded as we speak.
Well,
And
that brings, yes.
it's the last obstacle, to guarantee that our system survives.
Well, uh, I couldn't agree more, but I couldn't be worried more at the same time. What I've noticed here, and I've been to the mountain and I'm still climbing, but just to put things into context for everyone, I'm moving into 50 years into this arena. I've been an active person in the law enforcement, security, emergency management, emergency response arena for 50 years this coming February. I started my career in the Secret Service in 1974. I retired after 20 years with a diverse exposure to many of the things we're talking about. But since that time, I have been a security consultant. I've had clients ranging from Harvard to the American Battle Monuments Commission to a variety of large organizations, GW University, NASCAR, and many, many other organizations. And I can tell you, I've been asked with my collective experience to look at the very things we're talking about. But one thing that we don't seem to have now, or seems to be eroding, we've lost that objectivity. That seems to be eroded. The ability to look at things
Mm.
and to see them as they are. The ability to look at things empirically and say, gee, this doesn't make sense. This isn't right. Evidence shows us this or that. Now we're seeing, and I'm seeing, much to my chagrin, an inability, whether it's purposeful or not, to look at things empirically and make adjustments based on your mission. And when Saul brought up the Department of Justice, I have to say, sadly, I don't believe they are sharing or looking at things empirically. It appears, based on circumstances that are occurring, facts that are out there, that they're making biased judgments in favor of a political agenda or party. And these things are disturbing in many ways, but I'll give you an example, if I may. Saul brought up January
Please.
6th. And January
It,
6th
let,
forces
let, let me
people,
ask you something specific on January 6th
please.
first, because this is an impression I had, but I never had the opportunity to discuss it, much less in public, with somebody of your experience. Uh, One thing that has become almost a, a, a banner for some people who call themselves the right. Frankly, right left doesn't have any meaning to me. Uh, and the case is that of Miss Babbitt. When I saw the video, the first time I saw that video, practically as it was happening, I saw this young lady with a backpack climbing through a broken glass in a door that I knew all too well, that separated a rather public area from a rather private area where I assumed the vice president would be.
It's correct.
And this woman, she goes through the broken glass amid calls not to do it with a backpack. She was, alas, shot in a most unfortunate manner. It was one shot, it hit her in the neck, and she died of that wound. What would have happened if she had succeeded in crossing into that area and started running to that little bend 20 yards away, farther up, where the vice president and the Secret Service were?
Well,
How would the Secret Service have reacted to a woman with a backpack running towards them?
okay, just like everything in life evolves, let me give you a little context and then I'll give you a backup on some things. But in terms of responses, years ago, when I was a new agent, we trained with this concept of alert, shield, evacuate. Sound off, arms reach, cover and evacuate. Sound off, arms reach, cover and evacuate. And that was in the old days. Now, to make it a little bit easier, the common language, the common response to Saul's point, what would you do? You alert the shift, you say gun, danger, shield that protectee, and evacuate. That is the sort of the underpinnings of your protective posture, if you will. Now, hold that thought. When you do a proper advance with all kinds of entities assisting that protective perimeter, whether it's moving or stationary, you join forces with many others, local police, sometimes the military, SWAT teams. And ideally, that's a well-oiled machine. It's a very cohesive, integrated team, very integrated team. And our position as a protective detail, when a protectee is threatened, fits perfectly, as an example, with the stress management paradigm. When you are stressed, you go into a fight or flight response. Your body begins physiological changes to expect wounds, more coagulation, you get more adrenaline. And
Adrenaline and that little taste of
yes,
rusted nail that comes with it.
exactly. You know what I'm talking about.
Yes.
Well, that physiological response to a threat fits perfectly with what you are trying to do when a protectee is in danger or you see danger. You alert, you shield, and you evacuate. Now, if you can imagine the outer perimeters, they are mad about this. They're upset. Frankly, they're infuriated. They're pissed off. They look at this and say, wait a minute, you are assaulting my mission here. Well, they get into a fight mode. So they get more focused. Their adrenaline and their stress response is to become riveted to that risk and take it out, neutralize it, create barriers, whatever the case may be. So your example fits the stress management paradigm, the physiological response of both sides. Now, what they did was correct. There are times in my history where we've had to evacuate or cover a protectee for a variety of things, a fence jumper, things like that. So these things are in history. These things are well documented and so forth. But may I speak briefly, Saul, about your example at the Capitol? That is clearly was a very difficult day for everybody concerned, no doubt about it.
Oh, yes.
The vice presidential detail, I've read a lot of documents about it, did the appropriate thing. What I'm concerned about, though, and I want to back up a bit if I could. I've spent most of my post-Secret Service professional life now. I do a lot of training of military, police, emergency responders, school, security folks, a variety of folks. And what we've come away with since 9/11 is the proactive piece. Prior to 9/11, that wasn't as emphasized as it should have been. The prevent piece, the prevention piece, it just wasn't emphasized. It was more a response mode after the fact.
Yes. I fear, by the way, that we are slowly drifting back into that.
Well, there's empirical evidence to show that, so I'll tell you in a moment about that. It concerns me because any good Boy Scout can tell you, be prepared. Also, any good Boy Scout can rattle off the 12 points of the Scout Law, the first of which, the Scout is trustworthy. So I'll leave you with that, but let me get back to this. When you talk about January 6th, I've looked at lots and lots of documents. I've listened very carefully to all the testimony of the chief on that day, Chief Sund. And what I'm outraged about, concerned about, heartbroken about, and just a mix of very visceral emotions is the fact, documented fact, that several days prior, he was reaching out to the FBI, reaching out to the INA, reaching out to DHS and the Secret Service, and was pleading the most fervent entreaty you would ever hear. He's a true professional. Please tell me, is there any serious demonstrations going to occur? I'm hearing some things that are very concerning to me. Through the grapevine, I'm hearing that congressmen may be and women may be sought after, injured, or even killed. I'm hearing that law enforcement are being targeted. He started this process well before January 6th. It became more formalized with all his committees.
I saw the first signals that was going on and that those were his pleadings.
Yes. And he was
January 3rd.
Right. He was being a very proactive person because he was using precedent, being a good, diligent law enforcement person, a common sense man. He was looking at November and December prior to January 6th, and there had been some demonstrations, a few little skirmishes, a little bit of roughhousing, and maybe some shenanigans and a few arrests. But he knew that this particular demonstration was unprecedented. It was the beginning of a new administration, and there was a lot of contesting going on about voting. So he was following his instincts, his history. Long story short, he was asking, please, I'm hearing things that are very concerning to me. So the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, on the 5th, he had the heads of the agencies. This is documented. This is empirical. It's not made up. There's evidence to show this. He had the heads of these respective divisions that would handle the intelligence of insurrection, rioting, shenanigans, assaults, whatever the case may be. He was with the top intelligence heads of our government, FBI, INA, Secret Service, DHS, and probably some input from the CIA. And they were saying officially in his Zoom calls that nothing more than the ordinary, maybe some minor or moderate types of activities. Well, now, we're coming to find out that there were a lot of assets by the Justice Department and the FBI involved with some of these Proud Boys and some of these groups as undercover folks addressing this, hearing about these things, but it wasn't shared. They were also basically claiming, even though this was prolific on social media, Chief's son was
I,
looking at this.
I was going to say the talk in social media was deafening, and
And
on certain internet chats, it, listen, I don't have access to intelligence, but in my podcasts in January 4 and 5, I was begging people not to go to Washington because there was a lot of talk about trouble brewing, and it wasn't a good idea to be in the middle of it.
I agree with you. And candidly,
And
that
if I could see it, I imagine that people with access to intelligence had a more clear view of what could happen.
well, that admonition is perfectly placed. I mean, I would have said, I said the same thing.
Yeah.
And candidly, with all of the intel that was going on, folks should have been warned. But here's the rub, and here's something that I consider egregious. I'm sorry. I pride myself in being logical. I try to be apolitical. I look at things in an open mind. And one of the excuses by the intelligence agencies was that they didn't have the capability to monitor the social media. Simply not
Oh,
true.
so
Simply
I
not
do and they
true.
don't.
That's why it's simply not true. To show you that this is an apolitical problem, I mean, it affects everybody. Senator Peters, published in June 27th of this year, and I'll quote it to you. It's on the internet. It says Peters' report finds significant intelligence failures by the FBI, DHS in the lead up to the January 6th Capitol attack. He
Yeah.
talks several instances, many more than Chief Son was talking about. In fact, there were documented proof and instances of assets in the crowd encouraging folks to go to the Capitol.
Yeah.
Now, you can come to your own conclusions, but candidly, these things were very disturbing because this might have been preventable at the very least,
Absolutely.
at the very least
Let me
mitigated.
ask you two more questions because,
Yes,
just as an outside observer,
yes,
ever since 9/11, there was a bigger concentration on uh, evacuation, passing information, because the notion, the up until that moment unthinkable notion that somebody may crash a plane into the Capitol now became uh, a distinct possibility. And lots of planning was done to ensure that the capital could be evacuated, to protect the capital in the event of unrest. And every 6 months, they would have a drill and they had a plan of action. Now, for some reason, on January 6th, that plan of action was not implemented.
well, you're bringing up a very salient point, to use your term. I can tell you after 9/11, and let me give you some history. I taught this a lot, and this was infused in all our prevention and deterrence of terrorism classes, our prevention of school shooter training, all the things that are very important to us, common sense. So the DHS protective mandate, shall I say, whether it was military, police, whatever it was, basically these were there were four key national protective strategies, and they added a fifth after 9/11. And basically the five are prevent, protect, mitigate, respond, recover. Prior to 9/11, the prevent piece was not there. It
Right.
just wasn't. Everybody was geared, trained, and comfortable with
To
being in a
respond.
response mode. And of course, we found that was an egregious failure. Anyone
Oh,
that's read the 9/11 Commission report, it's spelled out there very, very clearly. So
oh
this is
yes.
why I'm very concerned.
Listen, I trained hundreds of crews, uh, on the premise that if your plane is hijacked,
Yes.
do not resist, do not confront. If a hijacker tells you they have a bomb, take him at his word. Don't even try to verify. And don't forget to bring me a box of cigars from Cuba.
Yes. Exactly.
That
Exactly.
that was,
Yes.
you know,
We,
it, passivity was the uh, 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 what would bring you back home in one piece.
yes. Well,
9/11 changed that.
I agree with you. But the thing that I find egregious um, about the current responses, and particularly January 6th, is that that primary bedrock change in our systems of
Prevention.
protection, our systems of military response and law enforcement, that key new element, the underpinning, the prevention piece, was taught
Completely
everywhere.
ignored.
All this, yes, all the strategies were infused with that. A lot of laws and a lot of funding and training was focused on that very important piece. In fact,
Yeah.
they created the Joint Terrorism Task Force, which had entities from FBI, local police, the military, and they became a very prolific entity with nearly 80 offices throughout the country whose mission it was and remains to be proactive, to look at the tea leaves, look at behaviors,
Yeah.
look at social media, to do what? To prevent these things. Why in the world, prior to January 6th, wasn't Captain Chief Sund and others listened to? Even after the attack
No.
began, he
And,
was
and, and there
begging
was
people,
more. There was more.
yes,
I
to
remember media reports that the National Guard had been authorized up to
yes,
20,000, that
mhm,
5,000 troops were already in DC. There were
yes,
pictures of National Guard soldiers in DC on January 4th. But congressional authorities absolutely refused to deploy them on Capitol Hill for a question of optics. Talk about prevent.
yes.
And, and,
And
and
so,
Mayor Bowser demanded that they be removed from her city.
this is the conundrum for someone who's been in the business now 50 years. I would ask them to please explain this to me. Honestly, explain this to me. How in the
Yeah.
world can you have intelligence of this magnitude? What's the matter with being in a preventive mode? The cost of that is minimal compared
Yes.
to
They,
what we
they had
saw.
3,500 officers available, only
Yes,
230 were deployed.
yes.
And you know how big that area is.
I do. 58.5 acres of the actual footprint of the Capitol and
Right.
its grounds.
Those 200 people were essentially two here, one there, left to their own devices.
Right.
And when they, I believe, did the common sense thing, when you have
Sure.
a horde coming at you can do one of two things: commit suicide by mob, or let them go by.
Right.
And
Well,
when they did that, they were accused of inviting them in.
it's just, it's unbelievable because it just flies in the face of common sense preventive measures readily available, and you could have had folks demonstrate peacefully. And those that were thinking about demonstrating with destruction and violently would have
Yeah.
been held at bay. That would have been a
Yes.
very straightforward solution.
Listen, you have a 500,000 people who want to demonstrate peacefully and a couple of thousand who want to create trouble.
Right.
It was very controllable unless you decide that you don't want to control.
Well, and it is 20 years old now. I go back to the 9/11 Commission, but it says, it was a catastrophic uh, lack of imagination, a catastrophic intelligence failure. And the reason it was, which the current strategies have changed with that prevention piece is because many of these agencies were siloed. There's some key elements and key chapters in that, and I've used it in my teachings, saying basically that how in the world can you create a team if only a couple of members of the team have this play? Another member knows who's going to catch the ball. The coach knows something over here. You have a completely siloed, disconnected,
you have
decentralized team.
200 people, each with a part of a car engine. It's not going to run. You need to put it together somehow.
Exactly. In fact, I was reminded of this when I read Senator Peters' report, Democrat from Michigan, who headed this up on the post investigation, the intelligence failures of January 6th. And he basically said it was really a lack of imagination, a lack of common sense intelligence. It reminded me of the same thing that they said.
And by the way, I don't want people who are listening to us to think that I am saying that anybody did it on purpose, because I'm not that crazy yet. But sometimes, I don't want to do this because it looks bad. I don't want soldiers in the Capitol because it gives the wrong image. That is stupid.
Well, candidly, it just does not make sense to me, and this is why I'm concerned. I mean, I've given my life to this arena, and many of my family members.
The triumph of optics over reason, and that brings us to the reason that we ended up on January 6th, which I could talk for another 3 hours with you on the subject.
Yes,
was that coordination between Secret Service, Capitol Police, DC Police, all kinds of different services that had to work together, with the vice president in one corner and 100 feet away, an angry mob, some of whom were calling for his demise.
right.
And suddenly all of the services have to work together. Now they all have, you say, the same laudable purpose, but sometimes contradictory missions.
Exactly. And it's interesting you bring that up because there's a couple variables here. The first one I'll bring to your attention is that in the subsequent investigations of January 6th and subsequent prosecutions, many of the Department of Justice prosecutions have invoked the idea, which candidly is not correct, that the entire 58.5 acres was designated as 1752 restricted by Secret Service. Well, candidly, if you have that, you have roped areas, signage, dogs, metal detection, inspections, bag checks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Retroactively saying that really is a stretch. You could have enacted that if you wanted to, if you knew about some of the problems with the intelligence that was out there. They didn't.
Yes.
So the problem is, to Saul's point.
It wasn't even posted.
Right.
Never mind soldiers with canines. It was not posted. There was no signs that told anybody that this greenery here, that looks more like a dog bathroom than anything else, is now out of bounds. There was nothing to suggest that.
Exactly. So to your point, Saul, and for our audience, this is an interesting segue to what we're talking about in terms of Uncharted Waters. And that is, had this been done correctly, candidly, I've done advances at the Capitol for State of the Union addresses. I've done advances all over the planet for the Pope, the President, you name it, wherever it is. And had they done the proper advance, there would have been exactly what Saul's talking about and suggesting. There would have been an integration of the authorities of Capitol Police, Metro Police, Park Police, Secret Service, Arlington Police, perhaps. All of those respective authorities would have been homogenized and categorized to figure out how can we make all of this work with our respective authorities. Very good. Same thing with these uncharted waters now that we're looking at on the unforeseen, ridiculous notion that President Trump would be under house arrest or whatever the case may be. If that in the
Well,
far
house arrest is not that bad.
yes,
If we're going to speculate the uncharted waters, uh, I'm going to exaggerate the point
yes,
for argument effect. But
yes,
imagine that he goes to court in New York. It's a state court. It's not a federal
right.
court. Now, this is uh, um, something that baffles me. I don't believe that state courts can try someone for an alleged crime committed while in the exercise of his functions as president of the United States.
Well, this is what their legal authorities are arguing, and many very reputable
Yeah,
authorities are
I
discussing these
yeah,
points right now.
I
But for our
very much doubt that they have that capability. But let's assume, for argument's sake again, that they do. And a
right,
very irate judge
yes,
who does not like the fact that President Trump is out there in rallies bad mouthing the courts and
right.
anybody who might be a witness against him, and orders that he be held in Rikers Island.
Well, here's the thing. A lot of this,
It's not going to happen, but
yeah,
let's
no.
imagine.
But this type of thing, though, would have to would require exhaustive discussions, exhaustive negotiations to maintain the sanctity of the 3056 statute and also the building or grounds statute. And the Secret Service has a lot of power to do that. And
Mhm.
depending again on leadership and other points, how that middle ground is met and achieved is the challenge. It's uncharted, yes. But I can tell you, when we were talking about Clinton in these circumstances, it was very important to make sure that every entity was allowed to do their
Their job.
mission with authority and not in a haphazard, cumbersome way, particularly when you
No.
consider who it is and what it represents. Very delicate, and there's no reason why that can't be negotiated and properly mandated. And I think that's what you're going to see. The problem is now, when you compare it to Nixon, Watergate, Clinton with Monica Lewinsky at the White House, and now President Trump, this is
Oh,
expanded.
and the Paula Jones trial,
Yes,
he
it's
lost and ended
expanded to
up
the
paying
point where
$800,000.
it's liberties are being taken with the law, and by many legal experts, by the opinion of many legal experts, that's beyond comprehension. It's just so unprecedented and so stretched that it's creating angst among all of us. So this is where we are.
Yes,
So if we
there are
ever
a
had,
couple of so-called experts that have come now to say that President Trump cannot be a candidate unless Congress votes by 2/3 to approve it because he's guilty of insurrection. And look as I may, I have not found a single court of law in the fruited plain that has convicted Trump for insurrection.
well, it's a
And
stretch.
and and I wonder what happened to innocent until proven guilty
Well,
in
you
the
see,
mind of these legal minds.
well, this is why what Chief Sanders talked about and what many of the convictions of folks that were at the Capitol on January 6th, many of these convictions, certainly the breaking and entering, destruction of
Yep,
property, that's straightforward. But the concern I have are those that have been prosecuted by just being there. And
exactly.
there's a lot of investigations by many, including whistleblowers that have left some of these agencies. They've explained how these things, how these prosecutions have been orchestrated based on some pretty shaky
Wo-
ground.
Would you say that a good number of these people have been railroaded?
Say it one. Yes, I would have to say that based on empirical data and evidence. For example, there's a senior bureau agent who was given the charge that we have to arrest many more. Well, I've already explained to you the 1752 criteria. Well, most judges in the system, the federal system, have opted to do that, even though there's really no judicial precedent for it or mandate for it by the law. The other problem is that these folks that have, and God bless them, it's difficult to be a whistleblower. They've explained that what they've done, different agencies have done, is taken data, bank data, credit card data, and come up with these incredible lists. This is not me saying this. These are whistleblowers, senior whistleblowers. And they've said that, well, how do we call and distill this list to get good suspects? And so let's take me for example.
Let's for clarity, there are people who were there who deserve to be locked up for the remainder of their natural life. As far as I'm
absolutely, there are folks who misbehaved. Yes.
Yeah, people who misbehaved in an egregious manner, and
Destroyed
people who
property.
essentially committed an assault, which, contrary to some commentary, it's not the most grievous assault on the Capitol, because I remember when the Senate was bombed and the House was bombed, and in 1915 both were bombed, and I consider blowing up the Senate a tad more than what we saw on January 6th.
Yes, I agree.
And of course, that was Susan Rosenberg, whose sentence was commuted by President Clinton, and the Weather Underground guys who blew up the House, whose sentence was commuted by Jimmy Carter, because apparently that wasn't such a grievous assault on the institutions of this country.
Yes.
But nevertheless, those
agree.
people who were dressed in black, climbing walls, breaking windows, trying to disrupt the function of the joint session, I believe you have to lock them up once established that that's what they did. But when they throw in, a couple of retirees from Iowa who just happened to walk by and thought it was open, and many came after the hullabaloo, I think maybe pay a fine and go home.
Yeah, but the thing
and
is,
if they were just walking the grounds, it wasn't posted. There's no trespassing if it isn't posted.
No, and it wasn't manned that way. And it could have been, though. It could have been cordoned off. It could have been more robust security fence. It could have designated better demonstration areas and said, look, this is what we're going to have. The National Guard could have achieved that. So it's one of the challenges. Yes. So the other thing, I'll finish that, is that I agree, being on the grounds isn't necessarily felony trespass. When you go in, break windows, that's different. But there are folks, yes, there are folks that were supposedly in the grounds, and there's many convictions to this, where their data, their background showed that, yes, they were there. Yes, they bought food and they stayed a night in DC or Virginia. But the other part is they took these thousands and thousands of transactions that were given to them or were asked for by the FBI and the Department of Justice to see who was there. But to make the numbers manageable, and again, this comes from a senior FBI person, to make the numbers manageable, they said, well, Larry Cunningham bought a weapon in 2000. Well, that's a problem. So now we have me being there, but the fact that there's a nexus to me having a weapon. And they would use that, according to some of the retired or...
Not necessarily that you had the weapon in DC, but that you own one.
You had a weapon. So that was justification.
It could have been in the safe at home.
Yeah. So that's clearly disturbing. And this is why we're having our our discussion here this evening.
Do we still have a
We are
Fourth Amendment?
I beg your pardon?
Do we still have a Fourth Amendment?
Well, I'm wondering, I'm looking at this, and hopefully some of these efforts will revive that. But when we talk about uncharted waters, these are some examples, again, empirical examples that prove that we are in areas we haven't quite ever navigated before. We have some history, some precedent that might guide us. But the word right here, from my perspective, would be we have to proceed cautiously. I like to invoke Sullenberg years ago on the Hudson River when he landed
Yes.
the craft in the river. That was not in
Sully.
the Sully, yes.
I'm going to be the Hudson Sully.
Yes. So there's an example of someone who proceeded by the numbers. He looked, he drew upon all his experience, his wisdom, his value system, and his instinct, and he was able to navigate uncharted waters. And I would use that metaphor for where we are today. But at any rate, let's please be cautious.
Absolutely. Amen to that, my friend. And
And
we are approaching 10:30, which is the approximate end of our broadcast. Uh, let me see if I can end with a return to the Trump predicament. If the Secret Service is protecting the president in a court of law, and the judge orders that he be transferred to the marshals to be processed in a jail, and there has been no previous negotiation, I don't want to be the Secret Service agent in that situation. But what do you do?
Well, I can tell you, if you are committed and you understand your role, you would be bound by a very high authority, a well-established Title 18 section to remain in the presence and to be with that protectee.
Yes.
I was with Reagan in many circumstances, certainly not that, but remote circumstances in a Jeep when he decided to go off by himself. I was with him. There are times when it's unprecedented and you don't have all the accoutrements of protection, but you have to be resourceful, you have to be committed, you have to be apolitical, and you have to do your duty. And this is what I'm praying.
And you do not abandon your charge.
No. So that would be something, if there was a test of that, and I don't envision the marshals or even the New York Police Department acting that way.
I don't either. It was a purely intellectual exercise, if you will.
Yes, administrative. So I would say we have to be cautious. And so we talked about the three things. When I began this, the faith in our country, the faith in our system. We can't lose it now. We have to galvanize it to really stay with it. Eventually, we'll get back to normalcy. And I truly believe that.
Yes.
So that's the first one. We have to be resilient, and we have to be open.
I do too. I do
And then
too. And to those who see the sinister actions of a Moriarty in the background trying to set these things in motion, I'll just remind them never to attribute to malice what can be explained by stupidity.
There you go.
Which more often than not is the root cause of our predicaments. People don't think things through anymore.
That's right. So,
anything else you'd like to add before we finish?
Just that the last thing is, we're all products of our environment, products of our upbringing. And I like to invoke some things my mother taught me. She spoke 5 languages, gifted lady, and she was in the OSS during World War II before it became the CIA. And she was the real deal. She was a saint as far as I'm concerned. And of course I'm biased, but she left me with lots of great things, hard work and all that stuff. But one of her favorite expressions was an Italian expression. And basically she said, hope is the last to die.
Yeah.
La speranza è l'ultimo amore. Let's galvanize that hope
L'ultimo a morire. La
and
speranza è l'ultima a morire.
let's not
Eh,
die. Let's
No,
stay
and
with
and that is an answer. I always use this in other contexts. Uh, Dante, in his Divine Comedy, uh, describes the gates of hell, and on top of the entrance to hell, there is this sentence: "Lasciate ogni speranza voi che entrate, abandon all hope ye who enter here," which the
Yeah,
message being that hell is a place where there is no hope.
yeah, and we want to
If we
avoid that.
have no hope that this will improve, we are already in hell.
Right. And
So
in the process, you're going to need some strength, not only mental strength, but physical
no,
strength. So a random estuit sit, mensana and corpore sana. Pray for a sound
mens
mind and a
sana in
sound
corpore
body.
sano. That was
Yes,
the leitmotif of the club of fencing that my great grandfather founded and that I attended
exactly.
for many years. Mens sana
So,
in corpore sano. And by the way, other not so clean actors took that theme as well, but this one is from the 1880s, so it's clean and pure.
excellent.
But yeah, Mussolini picked up Mens Sana and Corpore Sano,
Yeah, I'm
but
sure he did.
just because a
Well,
bad actor picks it up doesn't degrade it in any way.
right.
Uh,
Well,
well, thank you so much, Larry. I always enjoy our conversation so much that I could go for the next 3 hours and not break a sweat. But alas, we promised the world in 1 hour, and the hour has passed. Uh, I hope that I can have you again in the future, and somehow, against my wishes, I have a feeling that events will require your presence to explain some things to us uh, quite a few times before we can relax.
well, I'm honored to share some of my experiences, and hopefully we can foster a team of hope here.
Yes, let's call it that. Let's call it that. Let's foster that team of hope. And that said, on that note, thank you, everybody. Thank you for your support for the Gold Institute for International Strategy. I did put here a couple of times a link that you can use. And if you cannot read it because it's going too fast or whatever, it is in the description of this video where you're invited to make a contribution to the Gold Institute for International Strategy, tax deductible to the extent permitted by law. And if you are watching this in the Odyssey channel of the Gold Institute, please, if you feel like it, click on support and contribute what you can, just so that we can continue our work and bring you information occasionally as well. I have nothing else, so thank you so much, Larry. I'll see you soon, I hope. And to
Yes.
everybody else, thank you for being with us, and good night.
Good evening and stay safe. Thank you.